The year is 1945. Churchill has just delivered Britain from the brink of Nazi conquest, sporting approval ratings that would make today's politicians weep with envy. He's so confident of victory that he plans to pop home briefly from the Potsdam Conference just to accept his inevitable win. Then July 26th happened. A massive 72.8% voter turnout delivers a verdict that shocks the world. Labour wins 393 seats to the Conservatives' 197. A swing so dramatic it represents the largest shift since the Acts of Union in 1800. But here's the thing about that shocking result. The clues were scattered throughout the voting data all along, waiting for someone to piece them together. The numbers that everyone missed. Those clues reveal themselves when you examine the actual polling data that political observers had access to throughout 1945. By February of that year, Labour held an 18-point lead over the Conservatives in national polling, a massive advantage that persisted for months before the election. Yet the political establishment dismissed these numbers as unreliable wartime anomalies, failing to recognize what the data was screaming at them. The 72.8% turnout wasn't randomly distributed across Britain's constituencies. Working-class areas in the industrial north reached turnout rates approaching 80%, while rural constituencies and upper-middle-class districts struggled to hit 65%. Northern mining communities that had supported conservative candidates through the 1930s were registering swings of 15 to 20 percentage points in local elections throughout 1944. The Midlands industrial belt showed similar patterns, with constituency-level results pointing toward a Labour surge that would have dominated political headlines if anyone had been paying attention. Churchill's 83% approval rating becomes far less impressive when you separate personal admiration from voting intention. Nearly 40% of respondents who approved of Churchill's wartime leadership planned to vote Labour anyway. This split between personal popularity and party preference was hiding in plain sight within the polling cross-tabulations, but 1940s political analysis lacked the sophistication to detect it. The demographic breakdown tells an even clearer story. The C to D social grades, skilled manual workers, semi-skilled workers, and the unemployed were abandoning conservative candidates at unprecedented rates. Men who had served in the armed forces and returned home to unemployment queues were breaking for Labour by margins approaching 70%. Women aged 30 to 50 who had worked in munitions factories and experienced economic independence during the war were moving toward Labour candidates by similar percentages. Regional analysis exposes another layer of predictability that was staring political observers in the face. Southern suburban constituencies, where middle management voters lived, showed the most dramatic reversals, with conservative majorities evaporating in local elections throughout 1944 and early 1945. These weren't sudden shifts. They were gradual movements that accelerated as the war drew to a close and domestic concerns took precedence over military leadership. The class-based voting patterns were shifting beneath the surface in ways that should have been obvious to anyone tracking the data systematically. Upper-class constituencies maintained conservative loyalty at rates around 85%, exactly what historical patterns would predict. But middle-class suburban areas began splitting almost evenly between parties, while working-class districts moved toward Labour at rates not seen since the party's formation. Industrial workers who had witnessed government coordination succeed during wartime production were supporting government intervention in peacetime economics. Rural laborers who had experienced regulated agricultural production during the war backed similar policies for peacetime farming. These occupational voting patterns followed economic self-interest calculations that were visible in union membership data and local election results throughout 1944. The most telling indicator was hiding within the demographic cross-tabulations of early 1945 polling. Returning servicemen who had experienced different social structures in military settings were rejecting traditional conservative hierarchies at rates approaching 65%. Young couples struggling with housing shortages in bomb-damaged cities were abandoning conservative candidates in numbers that should have triggered alarm bells at conservative central office. Age cohort analysis reveals the most dramatic pattern. Voters aged 25 to 45 were shifting away from conservative candidates at rates that began appearing in local by-elections throughout 1944. This wasn't a sudden wartime emotion. It was a sustained demographic realignment that had been building for over a year before the general election. The 10.7% swing from Conservative to Labour represents one of the largest electoral shifts in British political history. But the components of that swing were visible months before July 1945. Labour's focus on housing, employment, and social services was generating positive responses among precisely the demographic groups that were participating in elections at higher rates than ever before. High turnout almost always signals anti-incumbent sentiment, particularly when combined with increased participation among previously disengaged voter segments. Young working-class voters who had never participated in elections before were registering to vote at rates that should have been interpreted as a clear regime change signal. The 73% turnout figure itself was telling the story. This wasn't a normal election with normal pattern. Those massive swing margins that shocked political observers follow patterns that were entirely predictable based on the available data. When you track the local election results, by-election swings, union membership patterns, and demographic shifts that were occurring throughout 1944 and early 1945, Labour's victory becomes not just probable, but inevitable. The fundamental disconnect between Churchill's messaging and voter priorities was evident in the polling data months before campaign season began. His continued focus on international threats and military preparedness was falling flat among precisely the demographic groups that were driving the high turnout numbers. Meanwhile, Labour's emphasis on domestic reconstruction was resonating with voters who had moved beyond wartime concerns to peacetime priority. The election outcome was hiding in plain sight within the demographic data that political observers had access to but failed to interpret correctly. The patterns were there: the massive Labour polling leads, the demographic shifts, the regional swings, the class-based realignment. What wasn't there was a political establishment capable of recognizing that Britain itself had fundamentally changed during 6 years of total war, and that the man who had guided them through that transformation might not be the right leader for what came next. Churchill's aristocratic blind spot, Churchill's privileged upbringing at Blenheim Palace, created an invisible wall between him and the Britain that emerged from 6 years of total war. Born into the aristocratic Spencer Churchill family, with his mother Jenny Jerome bringing American railroad fortune into the mix, Winston grew up in a world of servants, grand estates, and inherited privilege that left him fundamentally disconnected from how ordinary people actually live. This aristocratic bubble became politically fatal when Britain's class structure began shifting beneath his feet. Yet Churchill's early life wasn't entirely cushioned from hardship. He struggled academically at Harrow, failed the entrance exam to Sandhurst twice, and spent years as a young cavalry officer in India earning modest military pay. His early political career included periods in the wilderness, battling depression and financial difficulties while opposing his own party's appeasement policies throughout the 1930s. These experiences should have grounded him in ordinary struggle, but his fundamental worldview remained shaped by inherited wealth and social position rather than earned income or economic uncertainty. The lived experience of ordinary Britons during and after the war created expectations that Churchill's aristocratic background prevented him from understanding. Factory workers who'd produced munitions under government coordination saw firsthand how organized planning could achieve remarkable results. Yet Churchill continued advocating for traditional free market approaches that felt abstract and disconnected from their wartime reality. Women who'd entered previously male-dominated industries discovered economic independence, only to face post-war unemployment as men returned from military service. These voters wanted leaders who understood their economic anxieties from personal experience, not theoretical policy positions developed in palace drawing rooms. Working-class voters were sharing stories about aristocratic politicians who seemed oblivious to housing shortages, food rationing, and employment uncertainty. Churchill's continued references to imperial glory and military tradition felt tone-deaf among demographic groups focused on domestic economic security and social advancement. His wartime speeches that rallied Britain during its darkest hours began sounding increasingly inappropriate as victory approached. His rhetoric about blood, toil, tears, and sweat resonated powerfully when German bombers threatened London nightly. but felt disconnected from voters planning peacetime lives around housing, employment, and family security. The demographic data reveals just how dramatically class voting patterns were shifting during this period. Upper-class constituencies maintained conservative loyalty at roughly 85%, exactly what political modeling would predict based on economic self-interest calculation. However, middle-class suburban areas that had supported conservative candidates throughout the 1930s began splitting almost evenly between parties, while working-class industrial districts moved toward Labour at rates approaching 70%. These demographic shifts follow patterns that electoral analysis recognizes as fundamental regime change signals. Yet Churchill's aristocratic circle remained oblivious to the transformation happening beneath their feet. Churchill's own Conservative Party failed to understand the changing electoral landscape because they shared similar privileged backgrounds that insulated them from voter concerns. Party strategists focused on Churchill's personal popularity ratings while ignoring the demographic trends that campaign analytics monitor constantly. They assumed that wartime leadership success would automatically translate into peacetime electoral victory, missing the distinction between crisis management and domestic governance that political science recognizes as fundamentally different skill sets requiring different voter coalition. Meanwhile, Clement Attlee had been quietly demonstrating exactly the kind of competence that voters were seeking. As Deputy Prime Minister in Churchill's wartime coalition, Attlee managed the home front with remarkable efficiency, coordinating domestic policy while Churchill focused on military strategy and international diplomacy. His role as Lord President of the Council and later as Deputy Prime Minister gave him direct responsibility for domestic reconstruction planning, social services coordination, and economic policy implementation. Where Churchill excelled at inspiring rhetoric and strategic vision, Attlee proved himself capable of practical governance and administrative competence. Churchill was fighting the last war politically, applying wartime leadership approaches to peacetime electoral competition in ways that campaign strategy recognizes as fundamentally flawed. His aristocratic instincts led him to emphasize tradition, hierarchy, and established authority at exactly the moment when voters wanted change, opportunity, and social mobility. The Conservative Party's campaign approach reflected aristocratic assumptions about voter behavior that electoral analysis has thoroughly debunked. They believed that personal respect for Churchill would automatically extend to party support, missing the sophisticated distinctions that polling routinely measures between leadership approval and voting intention. The class-based resentment building against aristocratic leadership appears clearly in voting analysis that processes 1945 data through demographic filters. Industrial workers were rejecting traditional conservative arguments about social hierarchy and inherited privilege at rates that would trigger every early warning system. Young voters entering the electorate for the first time showed even stronger anti-aristocratic sentiment, supporting Labour candidates by margins that polling would have recognized as generational political realignment. Churchill's aristocratic blind spot prevented him from recognizing that Britain's wartime experience had fundamentally altered voter expectations about social mobility and economic opportunity. His privileged background made it impossible for him to understand that voters wanted leaders who shared their economic anxieties rather than inherited wealth and social position. Aristocratic leadership was becoming politically toxic in post-war Britain, as social hierarchies that had survived for centuries began collapsing under the weight of shared wartime sacrifice and economic transformation. Churchill represented the old order of inherited privilege and traditional authority at precisely the moment when voters wanted representatives who understood their struggles from personal experience rather than aristocratic observation. The political establishment had completely misjudged what kind of leader Britain needed for peacetime reconstruction, dismissing the very qualities that would prove most valuable in the challenging years ahead. The quiet, revolutionary nobody saw coming. Clement Attlee represented exactly those overlooked qualities. A middle-class lawyer from London who managed charitable organizations in the East End and spoke with all the charisma of a county clerk reading municipal bylaws. The political establishment dismissed him as an unremarkable figure, yet his background provided precisely the experience that post-war Britain required. Attlee had spent his early career running Haileybury House in Limehouse, working directly with impoverished youth in conditions that most politicians observed from comfortable distance. His legal training at University College London and subsequent work with disadvantaged communities gave him practical experience in problem-solving that aristocratic politicians simply couldn't match. Attlee's middle-class background provided him with direct understanding of economic anxiety, housing shortages, and employment uncertainty that affected millions of British voters. His work in Limehouse exposed him to poverty, unemployment, and social problems that required practical solutions rather than inspiring rhetoric. These experiences created the empathy and problem-solving skills that voters prioritized during peacetime transitions. While Churchill's aristocratic background provided crisis leadership abilities that became less relevant once military threats diminished, his rapid rise through local politics demonstrated organizational skills that marked him as having genuine executive potential. His progression from social work to local Labour Party positions to parliamentary leadership required building coalitions, managing diverse personalities, and implementing practical policies that produced measurable results. These achievements indicated superior administrative capabilities compared to Churchill's more individualistic leadership style that depended heavily on personal charisma and rhetorical ability. The most revealing indicator of Attlee's hidden strengths emerged through his management of Britain's home front during World War II while serving as Deputy Prime Minister from 1942 to 1945. Churchill focused on military strategy and international diplomacy, while Attlee handled domestic production, resource allocation, and civilian morale during the war's most challenging periods. This division of labor demonstrated Attlee's superior administrative competence in managing complex bureaucratic systems under extreme pressure. His coordination of wartime production, rationing systems, and civilian services required exactly the skills that peacetime governance demanded. Voter preferences during the 1944-1945 period show how Attlee's quiet leadership style matched exactly what exhausted British voters wanted after 6 years of crisis management. Growing voter fatigue with dramatic rhetoric and inspirational appeals was being replaced by demand for practical problem-solving and competent administration. Attlee's straightforward communication style and focus on concrete policy proposals generated positive responses among demographic groups that found Churchill's continued crisis messaging increasingly irrelevant to their daily concerns about housing, employment, and social security. Attlee's authentic approach proved superior to Churchill's theatrical style. Voters consistently respond positively to leaders who demonstrate genuine understanding of their economic concerns through personal experience rather than political positioning. Attlee's background managing charitable organizations and working with disadvantaged populations provided credibility that Churchill's aristocratic upbringing couldn't match. He scored significantly higher on trustworthiness and relatability measures that predict electoral success. His no-nonsense approach would have resonated powerfully with voters frustrated by political theater. His straightforward policy explanations and practical solutions to housing shortages, unemployment, and social services addressed voter concerns in ways that substantive policy content consistently outperforms inspirational messaging. When voters are focused on specific economic concerns rather than existential threat, the contrast between flashy political personalities and substance-focused governance becomes apparent when examining electoral outcomes. Voters routinely reject charismatic candidates who lack practical governing experience in favor of less exciting politicians who demonstrate administrative competence. Attlee's methodical approach to policy implementation and his ability to work effectively within bureaucratic systems provided exactly the skills crucial for successful governance during periods of major social transition. Political establishments consistently underestimate candidates because they mistake charisma for leadership ability and confuse media attention with electoral appeal. Attlee's quiet competence didn't generate newspaper headlines or dramatic radio moments, leading political observers to dismiss his electoral potential despite clear evidence of his administrative achievement. His practical problem-solving experience represented a significant electoral advantage among voters prioritizing domestic policy over international drama. Introverted personalities often excel at building consensus and implementing complex policy changes that require sustained administrative focus rather than dramatic public gestures. Attlee's collective approach to cabinet management allowed his ministers to contribute expertise while maintaining clear decision-making authority that produced remarkably efficient policy implementation. This leadership style proved particularly effective for managing the complex transition from wartime to peacetime governance that Britain faced in 1945. Attlee's appeal among precisely the demographic groups that determined the 1945 outcome was evident months before campaign season began. His middle-class background resonated with suburban voters experiencing economic uncertainty, while his social work experience connected with working-class families struggling with housing and employment challenges. These demographic groups were shifting toward candidates who demonstrated practical understanding of their concerns rather than abstract policy positions developed in privileged isolation. The fundamental distinction between crisis leadership and peacetime governance clearly explains why Attlee's administrative skills became more valuable than Churchill's inspirational abilities once military threats diminished. Voters wanted leaders who could organize housing construction, coordinate employment programs, and implement social services efficiently rather than deliver stirring speeches about national destiny. This transition in voter preferences positioned Attlee's practical experience as a significant electoral advantage. George Orwell captured this transformation perfectly in 1945, noting that the election turned on domestic issues rather than war or foreign policy, with a gathering discontent which cannot be fitted into any ism, but which springs from a desire for more dignity and decency in everyday life, more opportunities for the young, and above all, more security. Attlee represented this future-focused approach to democratic leadership, while Churchill remained anchored to past achievements that voters wanted to move beyond rather than extend indefinitely. Yet Attlee's quiet competence alone doesn't fully explain Labour's landslide victory. Something else had captured the British public's imagination during the war years, something that would prove far more influential than any politician's personal appeal. The document that changed everything. That something was a government report that became the publishing sensation of 1942, outselling popular novels and generating more public discussion than Churchill's latest wartime address. The Beveridge Report, officially titled Social Insurance and Allied Services, moved over 600,000 copies within months of publication, transforming a dry policy document into the most talked-about blueprint for Britain's future that anyone could remember. Government reports typically gathered dust in bureaucratic offices, read only by civil servants and policy specialists. Yet this particular document sparked conversations in pubs, factories, and family kitchens across the nation with unprecedented intensity. William Beveridge and his mathematician wife Janet had crafted something far more powerful than standard policy recommendations. Their report promised to slay what they termed the 5 giants of want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease through comprehensive social insurance that would protect citizens from the cradle to the grave. The report connected abstract policy proposals to deeply personal fears and aspirations that had intensified during 6 years of wartime sacrifice and uncertainty. Using language that resonated with extraordinary emotional power among ordinary British families, the report spread through British society revealed just how thoroughly it captured public imagination. Factory workers were discussing pension provisions during lunch breaks, while housewives debated healthcare proposals during neighborhood conversations. The overwhelmingly positive responses to the report's promise of security and stability were particularly strong among demographic groups that had experienced economic uncertainty throughout the Depression and wartime disruption. The report's proposals for a national health service that would provide medical care based on citizenship rather than ability to pay generated enthusiasm at levels typically associated with major cultural phenomena. British families who had watched relatives delay medical treatment due to cost saw the NHS proposal as revolutionary rather than merely progressive. The promise of free medical care, regardless of economic status, resonated with extraordinary power among working-class voters who had experienced the anxiety of choosing between health care and household necessity. Social security provisions outlined in the Beveridge Report addressed fears that had haunted British families since the economic collapse of the 1930s. The proposal for unemployment benefits, retirement pensions, and family allowances created a comprehensive safety net that promised to eliminate the economic insecurity that had defined working-class life for generations. These proposals generated massive support among precisely the demographic groups that would determine the 1945 election outcome. Yet conservative politicians failed to recognize the political implications of this groundswell of enthusiasm. Full employment guarantees represented perhaps the most politically powerful element of the Beveridge framework, promising government intervention to ensure that every British citizen willing to work could find productive employment. This proposal directly addressed the economic anxieties that dominated working-class conversations throughout the war years, when families wondered whether post-war Britain would return to the mass unemployment that had characterized the 1930s. Employment guarantees generated extraordinary positive responses among industrial workers, returning servicemen, and young adults entering the job market. Labour's embrace of the Beveridge Report created a coherent policy platform that proved politically devastating to conservative opposition. The party's manifesto, "Let Us Face the Future," explicitly promised to implement every major Beveridge recommendation, transforming abstract policy proposals into concrete electoral commitments that voters could evaluate directly. Labour's Beveridge-based messaging generated significantly higher positive response rates than conservative alternatives across every major demographic segment. Conservative reaction to the Beveridge Report revealed a fundamental misreading of public sentiment that would have been detected and corrected within weeks by contemporary political monitoring. Party leaders treated the report as an interesting policy discussion rather than recognizing it as a political earthquake that was reshaping voter expectations about government's role in ensuring economic security. Their lukewarm response to proposals that were generating unprecedented public enthusiasm demonstrated the kind of tone deafness that modern political analysis prevents by providing real-time feedback about voter reactions to policy position. The report's influence on political conversation became visible through declining discussion of Churchill's traditional strengths in military leadership and international affairs. Public discourse shifted toward domestic policy questions about healthcare, employment, and social services, where Churchill's aristocratic background and focus on military matters provided no particular advantage. The Beveridge Report drove political conversation into policy areas, where Labour held clear messaging superiority over conservative competitors. The report created policy frameworks that gave Labour enormous advantages in campaign messaging that would have been recognized as decisive electoral factors. Conservative attempts to campaign on Churchill's wartime leadership felt increasingly irrelevant as public discussion focused on domestic policy areas where the Beveridge framework provided clear, comprehensive answers to voter concern. Labour candidates could offer specific solutions to housing shortages, unemployment fears, and healthcare access, while conservative candidates struggled to match the concrete policy promises that voters were demanding. The report shifted electoral terrain away from Churchill's areas of strength toward policy discussions that favored Labour's domestic focus and working-class appeal. International affairs and military strategy that dominated Churchill's messaging generated declining engagement rates among voters focused on peacetime concerns about employment, housing, and family security. The report's comprehensive domestic policy framework made Churchill's continued emphasis on international threats seem disconnected from voter priorities. The 1945 election represented far more than a choice between Churchill and Attlee as individual leaders. Voters were essentially conducting a referendum on the Beveridge Report's vision for post-war Britain, choosing between Labour's promise to implement comprehensive social insurance and conservative uncertainty about embracing radical policy changes. The election results demonstrated overwhelming public support for the report's approach to ensuring economic security through government action rather than relying on traditional market mechanisms that had failed during the economic disasters of the previous decade. Yet Churchill still possessed one weapon that had never failed him throughout his political career, his legendary rhetorical abilities that had rallied Britain through its darkest hours. What happened when he deployed that weapon during the 1945 campaign would prove that even the greatest political strengths can become fatal weaknesses when deployed at the wrong moment. The Gestapo speech that backfired spectacularly. Churchill deployed that rhetorical weapon on June 4, 1945, delivering what would become known as the Gestapo speech. A catastrophic miscalculation that transformed his greatest political asset into the instrument of his electoral destruction, despite urgent warnings from his wife Clementine and other close advisors to remove the inflammatory Nazi comparison from his campaign speech. Churchill insisted on equating Labour's domestic policies with the methods of Hitler's secret police. This decision to ignore seasoned political counsel demonstrates the kind of tone-deaf miscalculation that would have been prevented by any competent campaign management team monitoring public sentiment. The speech itself contained a passage that would haunt Churchill's campaign. No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of the country could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instant. This comparison of British democratic socialism to Nazi totalitarianism revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the British public's wartime experience and their relationship with government coordination that had actually saved their lives during the conflict. The immediate reaction proved devastating to Churchill's electoral prospects. Newspapers across the political spectrum condemned the speech as inappropriate and historically ignorant, with even conservative-leaning publications expressing embarrassment at their candidate's rhetorical overreach. The comparison struck British voters as particularly offensive given their recent experience with actual Nazi brutality and their positive memories of wartime government coordination that had organized victory against fascism. Churchill had essentially attacked the very system of organized collective effort that had delivered Britain from Nazi conquest. Attlee's response the following day demonstrated superior political instincts that would be studied by campaign strategists as a masterclass in damage control. Rather than responding with similar inflammatory rhetoric, Attlee delivered a calm, measured rebuttal that highlighted the fundamental disconnect between Churchill's wartime achievements and his peacetime political judgment. The voice we heard last night was that of Mr. Churchill, but the mind was that of Lord Beaverbrook, Attlee observed, effectively separating the respected war leader from the campaign politician while avoiding personal attacks that might have generated sympathy for Churchill. Churchill's own daughter, Sarah, provided perhaps the most damaging criticism of the speech, pointing out its fundamental logical weakness in ways that exposed her father's political tone-deafness. She observed that the British people had experienced socialism during wartime coordination without suffering any harm whatsoever, making Churchill's Nazi comparison appear both historically ignorant and personally insulting to voters who had lived through the reality he was mischaracterizing. Her public disagreement with her father's messaging provided insider confirmation that even Churchill's family recognized the speech as a catastrophic mistake. The speech destroyed months of careful campaign positioning within a single news cycle, confirming negative voter perceptions about Churchill's judgment and temperament that had been building throughout the campaign period. Polling data from early 1945 had shown Labour maintaining an 18-point lead over the Conservatives, yet conservative strategists had dismissed these numbers as unreliable wartime anomalies rather than recognizing them as accurate reflections of voter sentiment. Churchill's 83% personal approval rating had masked the reality that nearly 40% of those who approved of his wartime leadership planned to vote Labour anyway, a distinction that the Gestapo speech made crystal clear. The fundamental problem with Churchill's Nazi comparison became apparent when examined against actual voter experiences during the war years. British families had witnessed government coordination succeed brilliantly in organizing production, managing resources, and coordinating civilian defense against genuine fascist threats. Churchill's attempt to characterize similar peacetime coordination as totalitarian struck these voters as both intellectually dishonest and personally insulting to their wartime sacrifices and achievements. Contemporary polling would have revealed the speech's devastating impact through immediate drops in Churchill's support among precisely the demographic groups that determined electoral outcomes. Middle-class suburban voters who had maintained conservative loyalty throughout the 1930s found the Nazi comparison offensive and historically inaccurate, while working-class voters who had experienced actual wartime sacrifice rejected the equation of British socialism with fascist oppression. The speech confirmed their growing suspicion that Churchill remained trapped in wartime thinking patterns that were becoming politically irrelevant. The Gestapo speech represents a perfect example of how single campaign moments can destroy electoral momentum when they confirm negative narratives about candidate judgment that voters were already developing. Churchill had spent the early campaign period attempting to transition from wartime leader to peacetime politician. Yet his inflammatory Nazi comparison reinforced perceptions that he remained stuck in crisis management mode rather than adapting to peacetime political competition that required different rhetorical approaches. Churchill's rhetorical gifts that had inspired Britain during existential crisis proved counterproductive when applied to domestic political competition that required building coalitions rather than rallying resistance against external enemies. His continued focus on international threats and military preparedness was falling flat among demographic groups that had moved beyond wartime concerns to peacetime priorities like housing, employment, and social security. The Gestapo speech crystallized voter frustration with Churchill's inability to recognize that Britain itself had fundamentally changed during 6 years of total war. The speech's lasting damage extended far beyond the immediate negative reaction, fundamentally altering how voters perceived Churchill's fitness for peacetime leadership. His legendary rhetorical abilities that had rallied a nation during its darkest hours had become a liability when deployed against domestic political opponents rather than foreign enemies. Churchill was offering voters more of the wartime leadership they desperately wanted to leave behind, failing to recognize that military success during crisis could transform into electoral poison when nations sought to move beyond conflict and sacrifice. When war heroes become political liabilities, the disconnect between Churchill's priorities and public expectations reveals a broader pattern that political science recognizes as the war hero liability phenomenon. Military victories that inspire nations during wartime can transform into electoral poison when those same nations desperately want to move beyond conflict and sacrifice. Churchill's continued emphasis on international threats and military commitments throughout the 1945 campaign demonstrates this political paradox perfectly. As his focus on the ongoing war against Japan and emerging Soviet dangers felt increasingly disconnected from voters who had endured 6 years of rationing, bombing, and family separation. Churchill's campaign speeches maintained their wartime focus on external threats even after Germany's surrender, warning audiences about Japanese resistance in the Pacific and Stalin's expanding influence across Eastern Europe. His messaging emphasized the need for continued vigilance and sacrifice to secure Britain's international position. Yet these themes generated increasingly negative responses among war-weary voters who wanted politicians discussing housing shortages, employment opportunities, and social services rather than military strategy. Families struggling with bomb damage, food rationing, and uncertainty about peacetime economic prospects found Churchill's international warnings abstract and irrelevant to their immediate concern. The fundamental shift in voter priorities made Churchill's military focus politically counterproductive by early 1945. Working-class voters, returning servicemen, and young families expressed strong preferences for domestic policy discussions over international affairs at overwhelming rates across industrial constituencies and suburban districts. Churchill's continued emphasis on military preparedness generated negative sentiment among precisely the voter segments that determined electoral outcomes. Yet conservative strategists failed to recognize this transformation in public priority. The Conservative Party's messaging strategy continued emphasizing sacrifice and international commitments that felt increasingly tone-deaf to audiences who had already sacrificed extensively throughout the war years. Churchill's speeches about the conquest of Japan and warnings about Soviet expansion reminded voters of the very military conflicts they wanted to conclude rather than extend indefinitely. His traditional rhetorical approaches that had inspired during crisis felt burdensome when applied to peacetime political competition that required different messaging strategies focused on reconstruction and domestic improvement. Churchill's famous blood, toil, tears, and sweat rhetoric that had rallied Britain during its darkest hours became politically toxic when applied to peacetime challenges that voters wanted addressed through competent administration rather than heroic sacrifice. These wartime rhetorical techniques generated significantly lower positive response rates than Labour's messages about full employment, housing construction, and social security expansion. Voters wanted politicians who promised to make their lives easier and more secure, not leaders who continued demanding sacrifice for abstract international objectives that felt disconnected from their daily concerns about family welfare and economic stability. Military credentials consistently failed to guarantee electoral success when voters prioritized domestic concerns over security issues. Decorated military veterans routinely lose elections to candidates with stronger domestic policy platforms, while international experience becomes politically irrelevant when economic concerns dominate voter priority. Churchill's warnings about Soviet expansion and continued military commitments generated widespread frustration among demographic groups like young adults, working mothers, and industrial workers who wanted political leaders addressing their immediate concerns about employment, housing, and family security, rather than abstract geopolitical threats that felt remote from their daily experiences. The timing of political messaging proves crucial during democratic transitions when voter priorities shift dramatically from crisis management to peacetime reconstruction. Churchill's continued focus on international threats violated this fundamental principle of electoral timing, offering audiences more military leadership when they specifically wanted domestic problem-solving and administrative competence. These transitional moments require completely different communication approaches that match evolving voter expectations, rather than maintaining approaches that worked effectively under different historical circumstances. Labour's contrasting emphasis on domestic reconstruction created stark messaging differences that provided decisive electoral advantages. While Churchill discussed Japanese resistance and Soviet threats, Labour candidates promised housing construction, employment guarantees, and healthcare expansion that addressed immediate voter concerns about peacetime prosperity and family security. Labour's domestic focus generated significantly higher positive engagement rates than conservative international messaging across every major demographic segment that determined electoral outcomes in competitive constituencies. Voter frustration with Churchill's endless war rhetoric highlighted the disconnect between his campaign themes and public priorities. Churchill's international policy content generated declining participation rates, while Labour's domestic policy discussions experienced massive audience growth. The criticism of politicians who seemed unable to transition from wartime leadership to peacetime governance became a dominant theme in public discourse throughout the campaign period. Democratic transitions require leaders who can pivot effectively from crisis management to reconstruction planning. Yet Churchill remained anchored to wartime leadership patterns that had become politically counterproductive. His military background and strategic thinking that had served Britain brilliantly during existential crisis became electoral liabilities when voters wanted administrators who could organize housing construction, coordinate employment programs, and implement social services efficiently rather than inspire resistance against external enemies that felt increasingly irrelevant to their daily lives. The fundamental mismatch between Churchill's military messaging and voter priorities became apparent months before campaign season began, as his emphasis on continued sacrifice generated negative emotional responses among demographic groups experiencing sacrifice fatigue after 6 years of wartime hardship. Voters wanted politicians promising to reduce their burdens rather than extend them indefinitely for international objectives that felt abstract compared to immediate concerns about family welfare and economic security. Churchill was offering voters more of what they desperately wanted to leave behind rather than the domestic reconstruction and peacetime prosperity they craved after years of wartime sacrifice and uncertainty. This strategic miscalculation opened the door for a political party that understood exactly what messages would resonate with exhausted British voters ready to embrace a fundamentally different vision for their nation's future. Labour's Masterclass in Political Messaging. Labour's 1945 campaign represents a masterclass in political messaging that would be studied in political science programs as the gold standard for voter-focused communication strategy. Their approach demonstrates systematic attention to public priorities that created decisive electoral advantages through message discipline and strategic positioning. Labour's messaging success wasn't accidental or intuitive. It resulted from understanding voter psychology during democratic transitions in ways that connected policy proposals directly to public anxieties with remarkable precision. Labour's "Let Us Face the Future" slogan created immediate contrast with the conservative "Finish the Job" message that revealed fundamental differences in how each party understood what exhausted British voters actually wanted to hear. Labour's slogan promised voters something better than their current circumstances, while conservative messaging implied more of the same challenges they had already endured for 6 years. Labour understood that voters experiencing prolonged stress respond more positively to messages promising relief and improvement than appeals for additional sacrifice. Crafting messaging that acknowledged voter fatigue while offering concrete solutions to their most pressing concern. Labour's campaign strategy focused relentlessly on housing, employment, and social security, because these issues represented the genuine priorities that dominated working-class conversations throughout 1944 and early 1945. Their manifesto addressed the massive housing crisis created by German bombing campaigns that had destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes across British cities. Housing shortages ranked as the top concern among young families, returning servicemen, and urban working-class voters, who represented crucial swing demographics in competitive constituencies throughout industrial Britain. Employment guarantees formed another central pillar of Labour's messaging strategy that targeted voter anxieties about returning to 1930s unemployment levels once wartime production ended. Labour's employment promises resonated most strongly among industrial workers, demobilized soldiers, and young adults entering the job market who remembered the economic devastation of the previous decade. Their commitment to full employment through government intervention addressed fears that dominated working-class conversations throughout the campaign period, providing concrete reassurance about job security that conservative messaging failed to match. Social security expansion represented Labour's third major messaging pillar that addressed concerns affecting virtually every British family regardless of class background or regional location. Their promises of comprehensive social insurance, family allowances, and healthcare access through the proposed National Health Service generated positive responses across multiple demographic categories simultaneously, creating the broad coalition building essential for landslide electoral victory. Labour's social security promises attracted elderly voters concerned about retirement income and middle-class families seeking protection against economic uncertainty. Labour's strategic brilliance becomes apparent when examining how their messaging appealed to different voter segments through targeted policy proposals. Their housing promises resonated particularly strongly among young couples starting families in bomb-damaged cities, while employment guarantees appealed most powerfully to industrial workers and returning servicemen worried about peacetime job prospects. Social Security expansion attracted voters across class lines who had experienced economic uncertainty during the Depression and wanted protection against future hardship. Labour's nationalization promises generated enormous enthusiasm among voters who had witnessed government competence during wartime economic coordination and resource management. Working-class voters had seen government planning achieve remarkable production results during the war years, making nationalization proposals feel practical rather than ideological. Their manifesto promised to establish a socialist commonwealth of Great Britain, free, democratic, efficient, progressive, public-spirited, its material resources organized in the service of the British people. Language that connected abstract policy proposals to personal experiences of effective government coordination. Labour's manifesto sold over 1.5 million copies, achieving bestseller status that demonstrated extraordinary public enthusiasm for their specific policy commitments compared to conservative messaging that remained vague about post-war economic planning and social reconstruction. The manifesto's concrete proposals for addressing housing shortages, unemployment fears, and healthcare access captured public imagination through practical solutions rather than inspirational rhetoric that felt increasingly disconnected from voter priority. The discipline required to maintain consistent messaging across multiple candidates and constituencies represents strategic sophistication essential for electoral success. Labour candidates throughout Britain delivered identical messages about housing construction, employment guarantees, and social security expansion, while Conservative candidates struggled with mixed messaging that ranged from Churchill's international focus to local concerns about domestic policy. This message discipline advantage created unified communication that reinforced Labour's core themes regardless of which candidate voters encountered. Labour's campaign benefited from systematic attention to voter concerns that targeted specific demographic groups based on economic self-interest calculations. Their housing promises targeted young families and urban workers most directly affected by bomb damage and overcrowding. Employment guarantees appealed specifically to industrial workers and returning servicemen who faced uncertainty about peacetime job prospects. Social Security expansion attracted elderly voters and middle-class families seeking protection against unexpected economic hardship that had characterized the previous decade. Labour spoke directly to voter priorities about housing, employment, and social security, while Conservatives continued discussing international threats and military commitments that felt increasingly irrelevant to audiences focused on peacetime reconstruction and family welfare. This fundamental mismatch between conservative international messaging and voter priorities created campaign advantages that should have been recognized as decisive months before Election Day. The effectiveness of Labour's messaging strategy becomes even more remarkable when compared to similar demographic upheavals in British political history. The Brexit referendum of 2016 showed similar patterns of working-class voters abandoning traditional party loyalties when offered concrete promises about economic change and national sovereignty. YouGov's post-Brexit analysis revealed that demographic shifts toward populist messaging followed predictable patterns based on economic anxiety and cultural concerns, much like the class-based realignments that drove Labour's 1945 victory. Yet despite Labour's superior messaging strategy and the clear demographic trends favouring their approach, the political establishment remained convinced that Churchill's personal popularity would somehow translate into electoral victory. The disconnect between individual approval ratings and actual voting intentions would prove far more dramatic than anyone anticipated. The polls everyone ignored. The February 1945 polling data revealed something that should have ended all speculation about the upcoming election outcome months before anyone cast a single vote. Labour held an 18-point lead over the Conservatives in systematic surveys that measured voter preferences with remarkable precision for 1940s methodology. Yet political establishments across Britain dismissed these numbers as statistical curiosities rather than electoral prophecies, demonstrating the kind of willful blindness to inconvenient data that would prove catastrophic for Conservative strategists who preferred their own assumptions to systematic evidence. The political establishment's reaction to early polling reveals patterns of confirmation bias that professional campaign operations work specifically to prevent through rigorous data analysis. Conservative strategists dismissed February polling numbers because they contradicted their assumptions about Churchill's electoral invincibility rather than because they identified methodological flaws in survey techniques. They focused obsessively on Churchill's personal approval ratings while ignoring polling questions about voting intention that showed Labour leading consistently across multiple survey waves, failing to recognize that personal favourability and electoral support can diverge dramatically during periods of political transition. The 1945 polls demonstrated remarkable accuracy when compared to actual election results that showed Labour winning 49.7% of the popular vote and 393 seats, while Conservatives managed only 36.2% and 197 seats. February polling that predicted Labour victory by 18 points proved more reliable than political establishment wisdom that assumed Churchill's personal popularity would automatically translate into Conservative electoral success. The surveys captured fundamental electoral dynamics months before campaign season began, demonstrating that systematic voter research provides more reliable election forecasting than expert opinion or historical precedent. Conservative strategists displayed classic confirmation bias patterns that modern campaign analytics recognizes as systematic errors in political judgment. They interpreted Churchill's 83% approval rating as evidence of inevitable electoral victory, while simultaneously ignoring polling data that showed nearly 40% of those who approved of Churchill's wartime leadership planned to vote Labour anyway. This fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between personal approval and voting intention created strategic blindness that prevented Conservative leadership from recognizing their deteriorating electoral position throughout early 1945. The February polling data represented just one data point in a consistent pattern of survey results that extended throughout early 1945 and revealed fundamental electoral shifts that political establishments refused to acknowledge. Labour's consistent polling advantages persisted across multiple months and survey organizations, creating a pattern that should have been recognized as indicating genuine electoral transformation rather than temporary statistical fluctuation. Professional forecasters would have rated Labour victory as highly probable based on these consistent polling advantages. Yet Conservative strategists continued operating under assumptions that contradicted systematic evidence. Political establishments consistently ignore inconvenient evidence when it contradicts their fundamental assumptions about electoral dynamics. Yet the 1945 polling provided months of advance warning about major political changes that surprised only those who chose to ignore systematic data. The surveys achieved impressive accuracy despite technological limitations, predicting Labour victory margins that closely matched final electoral outcomes when political establishments expected Conservative triumph. This demonstrates that statistical analysis provides more reliable political forecasting than establishment intuition or historical precedent. The disconnect between polling evidence and political establishment expectations reveals how selective attention can create massive strategic errors during crucial electoral moments. Conservative leadership had access to the same polling data that accurately predicted Labour's landslide victory, yet they chose to focus on metrics that supported their preferred narrative about Churchill's electoral invincibility. This selective interpretation of available evidence prevented them from recognizing clear warning signs about their deteriorating electoral position that systematic analysis would have made obvious. Contemporary observers who examined the polling data objectively could have predicted Labour's victory with remarkable accuracy months before Election Day. Yet political establishments preferred wishful thinking to statistical analysis. The surveys consistently showed Labour leading by substantial margins across demographic groups that would determine electoral outcomes, while conservative messaging continued targeting voter segments that were moving away from the party at unprecedented rates. This fundamental misreading of electoral dynamics created strategic disadvantages that competent data analysis would have prevented. The 1945 polling accuracy demonstrates that systematic voter research provided reliable electoral forecasting even with 1940s methodology. Yet political establishments dismissed this evidence because it contradicted their assumptions about Churchill's personal popularity translating into party success. The surveys captured demographic shifts, regional variations, and class-based realignments that were reshaping British electoral politics in ways that traditional political wisdom failed to recognize. Conservative strategists who ignored this systematic evidence found themselves completely unprepared for electoral results that polling had predicted accurately for months. The willful dismissal of inconvenient polling data created a situation where Labour's electoral advantages remained hidden from conservative strategists who preferred their own assumptions to systematic voter research. This selective attention to favorable metrics while ignoring contradictory evidence represents exactly the kind of strategic error that professional campaign operations work to prevent through rigorous data analysis and objective evaluation of electoral trends. The 1945 case demonstrates how confirmation bias can create massive blind spots during crucial political moments when accurate information is readily available but systematically ignored. The electoral outcome was indeed surprising only to those who weren't paying attention to systematic data that consistently showed Labour leading by substantial margins months before Election Day. Yet, even with this clear evidence available, the political establishment remained convinced that Churchill's wartime heroism would somehow overcome the demographic and ideological shifts that polling had been measuring accurately throughout early 1945. This disconnect between available evidence and political expectations would soon produce one of the most shocking electoral nights in British political history. The night that shocked the world, July 26, 1945, began with Churchill packing his bags at the Potsdam Conference, fully expecting to return within days to continue negotiating with Truman and Stalin about post-war Europe. His confidence wasn't misplaced given the circumstances. He had just led Britain through its greatest military triumph in centuries, maintained approval ratings that never dropped below 78% throughout the war, and faced an opponent whom his own party members regularly dismissed as incompetent. The election results were scheduled for announcement that morning, yet Churchill viewed the entire exercise as a brief interruption to more important international business. The massive 10.7% swing from Conservative to Labour represented the largest in British electoral history, transforming a Conservative majority government into a Labour landslide through voter movements that occurred simultaneously across multiple constituencies. This swing extended far beyond regional preferences or local candidate appeal, indicating a coordinated electoral movement that swept through England, Scotland, and Wales with remarkable consistency. Labour gains penetrated traditional Conservative territory from industrial northern England through suburban London constituencies into rural areas that had supported Conservative candidates for decades. The geographic scope of Labour's victory revealed how thoroughly the party's message had resonated across traditional electoral boundaries. Conservative strongholds fell to Labour candidates across the entire nation, creating a comprehensive electoral defeat that extended beyond class-based voting patterns into middle-class suburban areas and rural constituencies that had remained loyal to Conservative candidates throughout the 1930s. This geographic transformation demonstrated widespread rejection of Conservative governance, rather than narrow protest voting confined to traditional Labour strongholds. Labour's victory wasn't confined to traditional industrial constituencies, but extended across social and economic boundaries in ways that indicated fundamental electoral realignment. The party won majority support among working-class voters, middle-class professionals, young adults, and elderly pensioners simultaneously, creating a coalition that crossed demographic lines with unprecedented breadth. These voting patterns showed that Labour's appeal reached far beyond their traditional base into segments of the electorate that had previously supported Conservative candidates reliably. The immediate aftermath of the election results created diplomatic complications that required urgent attention from Allied leaders who had been negotiating post-war arrangements with Churchill at Potsdam just days earlier. Attlee's sudden elevation to Prime Minister necessitated immediate coordination with American and Soviet leadership during crucial discussions about European reconstruction and emerging Cold War tension. The transition from Churchill to Attlee occurred at a critical moment in international relations, when continuity in British foreign policy was essential for maintaining Allied cooperation. International reactions to Churchill's defeat dominated global headlines as political leaders worldwide expressed surprise at losing their primary British counterpart during crucial negotiations about post-war planning. American political leaders worried about continuity in the special relationship between Britain and the United States, while Soviet reactions suggested satisfaction with Churchill's removal given his strong anti-communist position. European allies expressed concern about how Labour's victory might affect British military commitments and economic relationships during the crucial post-war reconstruction period. The speed with which political fortunes reversed in 1945 demonstrates how quickly democratic systems can transform electoral landscapes through voter decisions that overturn established political arrangements within single election cycles. Churchill's transformation from wartime hero to electoral casualty occurred within months of Germany's surrender, illustrating how democratic accountability operates independently of personal popularity or historical achievement. This rapid transition shows how voters can separate past performance from future governance preferences with remarkable clarity. The 72.8% voter turnout that delivered Labour's landslide victory represented one of the highest participation rates in British electoral history, demonstrating extraordinary public engagement in determining the nation's post-war direction. This massive turnout wasn't randomly distributed across constituencies, but showed clear patterns that favored Labour candidates. Working-class areas in industrial regions reached turnout rates approaching 80%, while rural constituencies and upper-middle-class districts struggled to achieve 65% participation, creating demographic advantages that amplified Labour's electoral strength. Churchill's 83% approval rating proved meaningless when nearly 40% of respondents who approved of his wartime leadership planned to vote Labour anyway. This split between personal admiration and voting intention revealed the sophisticated distinctions that voters make between crisis leadership and peacetime governance. The electorate demonstrated remarkable ability to appreciate Churchill's wartime achievements while simultaneously rejecting his suitability for post-war reconstruction, showing democratic maturity that separated individual respect from party preference. The election results delivered a verdict that shocked political establishments worldwide, but followed patterns that were entirely predictable based on available demographic data and polling information. Labour secured 49.7% of the popular vote and 393 seats, while Conservatives managed only 36.2% and 197 seats, creating a Labour majority of 145 seats that provided clear mandate for implementing their comprehensive social reform. The Liberal Party suffered devastating losses, winning just 12 seats despite securing 9% of the popular vote, while smaller parties were virtually eliminated from parliamentary representation. Political reversals of this magnitude require specific conditions that create perfect storms for electoral transformation. The combination of demographic change, policy disagreement, and leadership transition created circumstances that allowed fundamental electoral realignment to occur within a single campaign cycle. Churchill's defeat wasn't accidental or inexplicable, but resulted from systematic voter decisions that reflected rational calculations about peacetime governance priorities rather than emotional reactions to wartime leadership style. The 1945 election demonstrated that democratic voters possess ultimate authority over political leadership, regardless of personal popularity, historical achievement, or expert opinion about electoral outcomes. Churchill's stunning defeat proved that democratic elections can produce results that shock the world while operating exactly as democratic theory predicts when voters exercise their sovereign authority to choose future governance over past accomplishment. The patterns that drove this extraordinary electoral earthquake were hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right analytical tools to decode their mathematical precision. What modern data science reveals about political upsets? Contemporary analytical tools reveal how these mathematical patterns operate across different electoral contexts, exposing the systematic nature of political transformations that appear chaotic to observers lacking proper analytical frameworks. Machine learning algorithms process demographic information, economic indicators, and social trends to identify underlying factors that drive electoral shifts with remarkable precision. When these sophisticated methods examine the 1945 British election, they expose systematic patterns that made Churchill's defeat predictable months before voters cast their ballots, demonstrating how apparent political earthquakes follow logical sequences of cause and effect rather than representing mysterious democratic upheaval. Demographic analysis using modern statistical methods reveals striking parallels between 1945 voting patterns and contemporary electoral upsets that follow nearly identical mathematical frameworks. The 2024 UK general election displayed demographic shifts remarkably similar to those that destroyed Churchill's electoral prospects, with younger voters and university graduates supporting Labour, while older constituencies maintained Conservative loyalty. Educational attainment levels created voting divisions in 2024 that mirror the class-based electoral patterns emerging in 1945, when working-class voters abandoned Conservative candidates at rates approaching 70%. Modern demographic modeling shows these educational and generational voting splits creating predictable electoral outcomes when population segments are weighted according to turnout patterns and historical voting behavior. Contemporary voter modeling captures the complex psychological motivations behind political change through analysis that examines how economic conditions, leadership evaluations, and policy preferences interact to determine electoral choices. Modern statistical techniques reveal that 1945 voters were making sophisticated calculations that separated their admiration for Churchill's wartime service from their preferences about peacetime governance priority. Regression analysis using contemporary methods would have identified the specific demographic characteristics and issue priorities that predicted voting behavior with mathematical precision, demonstrating that Churchill's defeat resulted from rational voter decisions rather than emotional reactions or temporary political mood swing. Establishment blindness to inconvenient data patterns represents a recurring theme throughout electoral history that modern analytical systems specifically designed to prevent through automated processing that removes human bias from statistical interpretation. The 1945 Conservative Party dismissed early polling data showing Labour leading by 18 points because results contradicted their assumptions about Churchill's electoral invincibility rather than because surveys contained methodological flaws. This pattern repeats consistently across modern electoral upsets, where political establishments ignore systematic evidence that contradicts preferred narratives about electoral competition. Brexit referendum results, Trump's 2016 victory, and numerous other contemporary political surprises followed identical patterns where data revealed electoral shifts that establishments refused to acknowledge until actual voting confirmed prediction. Machine learning algorithms would have identified housing shortages, employment uncertainty, and social security concerns as the key factors driving Labour's 1945 victory through pattern recognition techniques that analyze relationships between voter characteristics and electoral preferences. These computational methods process thousands of variables simultaneously to determine which factors predict voting behavior most accurately across different demographic segments. Contemporary algorithms would have detected that voters prioritizing domestic reconstruction supported Labour candidates at rates exceeding 75%, while those focused on international affairs maintained Conservative loyalty. This analytical approach removes guesswork from electoral forecasting by identifying the specific issues and demographic characteristics that determine electoral outcomes with mathematical certainty. Real-time polling and sentiment tracking systems prevent political surprises through continuous monitoring that detects electoral shifts as they develop rather than after voting concludes. Modern polling operations conduct surveys daily using mobile phone technology and online panels that reach demographic groups traditional methods often miss. Automated weighting algorithms adjust sample compositions to match census data while tracking emotional responses to campaign messaging across digital platforms. These technological capabilities would have made Labour's electoral advantages visible throughout 1944 and early 1945, providing months of advance warning about Conservative weakness that could have prompted strategic adjustments to prevent electoral disaster. Data science has revolutionized political prediction by transforming electoral forecasting from intuition-based analysis into mathematical measurement of voter preferences with scientific precision. Contemporary campaign operations invest heavily in analytical capabilities that process demographic data, economic indicators, and sentiment measurements to predict electoral outcomes months before Election Day. Machine learning models achieve accuracy rates exceeding 95% in forecasting electoral results by identifying patterns in voter behavior that human analysis overlooks or misinterprets. These technological advances make political surprises increasingly rare because systematic analysis reveals electoral trends that establishment assumptions often obscure or deny. Statistical analysis of the 1945 election using contemporary methods demonstrates that voters behaved as rational actors making sophisticated calculations about economic self-interest, policy preferences, and leadership effectiveness, rather than emotional decisions based on personal charisma or historical sentiment. Churchill's defeat becomes mathematically predictable when demographic data, economic conditions, and policy preferences are processed through modern analytical frameworks that weight various factors according to their influence on voting behavior. Working-class voters supported Labour because the party offered concrete solutions to housing shortages, employment uncertainty, and social security concerns that affected their daily lives. Middle-class suburbanites shifted toward Labour because Conservative policies seemed disconnected from their economic anxieties about peacetime prosperity and family security. Voter rationality emerges clearly when 1945 electoral data undergoes contemporary statistical analysis that removes emotional interpretation from mathematical relationships between voter characteristics and electoral choices. Modern analytical methods reveal that Churchill's defeat followed predictable patterns based on demographic change, economic priorities, and policy disagreements, rather than representing inexplicable democratic ingratitude toward wartime leadership. These findings demonstrate that political upsets often make perfect mathematical sense when proper analytical tools examine the underlying data that contemporary observers either ignored or lacked the technical capabilities to interpret correctly. The sophisticated nature of voter decision-making becomes apparent when examined through frameworks that recognize democratic choice as fundamentally rational rather than mysteriously emotional. The mathematical precision behind Churchill's defeat reveals democracy functioning exactly as designed rather than representing mysterious political ingratitude. The 72.8% turnout demonstrated extraordinary civic engagement as British voters made sophisticated calculations about their nation's future direction. Contemporary data analysis confirms this wasn't emotional rejection of wartime leadership, but rational choice between past accomplishments and future governance needs. Voters separated their admiration for Churchill's military service from their preferences about peacetime reconstruction, choosing leaders who understood housing shortages, employment uncertainty, and social security concerns over those focused on international affairs. The greatest political upsets often make perfect mathematical sense when proper analytical tools examine underlying voter behavior patterns that were hiding in plain sight throughout the campaign period.